My name is Andrea Sparr-Jaswa. I am the science editor at Cannabis Business Times. I'm joined today by Beau Whitney, who is the vice president and senior economist at New Frontier Data. In this session on globalization, consolidation, and segmentation, we're going to be discussing production shifts as global markets open up, how the US will play a role in the expanding markets, the cost structures that will be needed to compete moving forward in the next 5 years, and what sort of policy standards will need to be put in place to help steer the industry towards sustainability. But I'd like to start a little with an introduction into how you became interested in cannabis economics and how New Frontier Data has enabled you to further your interests and have a voice in market trajectory.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's just a pleasure to be here. So I really want to thank all those involved for allowing me to have a little bit of a venue today to talk about the global cannabis marketplace. I've been in the cannabis industry for about 5 years now. I was teaching in economics class, and one of my students started asking about how to set up companies, how to set up business structures and the like. He let me know that he was in the cannabis industry, and this is in Oregon. And I asked him how large the market was, and he said, "I don't know, you're the economist, you tell me." And so I was very intellectually curious. I wasn't in the space. I was teaching economics, working in high-tech industry. And so I just went for it. And realizing how large the market was in Oregon, I decided to do this full time. And as a result, I put together a forecast for Oregon first and then national. Around that time, New Frontier Data was getting started. They realized that there wasn't a whole lot of data in the space. A lot of policy decisions were being made in a vacuum or based upon headlines, somebody getting really high in Colorado and not being able to leave their hotel room, for example. And so they realized that there was an absence of data. They went about it on the East Coast. I was doing similar efforts on the West Coast. And then about 3 years ago, we combined our intellect and insights, and it's been amazing ever since. The one thing that's interesting is that 5 years ago, I was this dorky economist in a sweater vest, right? And over the course of that 5 years now, I've been to practically every continent. We talked about policy for hemp and higher THC cannabis in Zimbabwe last year, heading to Berlin for the ICBC conference in April. This is the second time we've been speaking there. Went down to Panama, and a lot of these conversations were with ministry level members, presidential advisors and the like. So who would have thought 5 years ago that that would be the course of cannabis 5 years later? So it's been an amazing journey.
Where are we now in terms of US production environments, in terms of indoor, outdoor, and greenhouse sort of ratios?
So a lot of the cultivation right now is kind of forced indoors due to the illegality of the higher THC cannabis production. However, a lot of the production say on the West Coast is done outdoors. And so, the outdoor crops are being exported to other places around the country. I think 81% of all of the cultivation is sold through illicit channels. So there's a lot to that question, but as things get more mainstream, I envision larger scale commercial farming, and that would be more outdoor in nature due to the cost structure. Doesn't mean that a lot of those craft growers are going to be out of a job or out of a business. It's just, I think that there'll be fewer of the craft growers relative to the larger commercial ones.
What is influencing those sort of what other things are influencing production shifts in the US? And do you think there'll be production divergence between cannabis and hemp cannabis markets?
Yeah, what's driving a lot of this is cost. Consumers are very cost conscious. There's high levels of elasticity in the demand, meaning that consumers are price sensitive. And so So in that sense, if you have inexpensive cannabis, then consumers will gravitate towards it. That's why policy is really important, because if you have high taxation like they do, say, here in California, then it may price the legal growers out of the market. So price is a determinant, but quality is as well. What we're seeing is, indoor remains competitive because of the nature of its quality and its consistency. We're seeing imports from and interdictions from Mexico and the like going way down, considerably, like 80–90% fewer interdictions over the last 4 or 5 years. And that's because the southern, or the cannabis coming from Mexico and south of the border, it can't compete with the quality. So there's a quality aspect and a pricing aspect, which is driving innovation into the marketplace.
Absolutely. Cannabis was an industry long before Prohibition. Sears catalogs used to sell it. One of the ironies of Prohibition is that it gave us a community as well, a movement. How do you see large-scale indoor production playing out against the craft market, and will craft cannabis continue to hold its place within the industry, and how can those craft players strategize to retain a substantial market share against big businesses?
It's been interesting because we study not only the higher THC cannabis market, but the industrial side of the cannabis market as well. And we're seeing a little bit of a divergence just in that aspect. On the hemp side, there is large commercial operations generating tens of millions of pounds per year in biomass. And the smaller farmers cannot compete with that in terms of price. So what they are doing, and this is kind of in its nascent stages, they're teaming up with their fellow farmers and communities and forming co-ops. And so the co-op model is rather prevalent in the hemp industry, whereas I think on the higher THC side, it's going to take a while for that part of the market to develop. But what's interesting is that like I said earlier, there's going to be a place for both sides of the business, the commercial and the craft growers. It's just going to, I think, shift more heavily towards the commercial side as this market matures and as the regulations go more national and international.
Mm-hmm. Let's move up north a little bit to Canada. Do you think Canada will be a major producer, and is there a future for large-scale greenhouses in Ontario and the like?
Well, a lot of the licensed producers, or LPs, invested heavily in the Canadian markets. They got this war chest of money from inflated stock prices and the like, and they've deployed that money to establish these large commercial indoor grows. Unfortunately, they got a little bit too far out over their skis, and there wasn't sufficient demand in the Canadian market, which is roughly the size of the California market. There wasn't enough demand to satisfy all that supply. And in addition to that, on the, in the Parliament and in Canada, they've set up some policies which have limited the pace of the deployment of the retail system. So not only do you have this large amount of supply, or at least supply capacity, you don't have the ability to get it into the consumer's hands, and so that's exacerbated the illicit market. There was hope, and I think this was reflected in the stock prices, that the Canadians could translate that large capacity into the export market, but that hasn't materialized as much as people had thought, and as a result, they're not hitting their numbers. The large licensed producers are not hitting their numbers like they thought they would. There's some barriers to entry, say in the European Union, which is the market of choice for those producers. There's been barriers to entry that were unanticipated, and it's influenced the amount that could actually be exported. So are they going to be large players? I kind of doubt it. They had their run, and it didn't go so well, but there's going to be other countries that are going to supplant them eventually. There's still some time in the Canadian market, but I think their time is running out.
You mentioned stocks, so let's kind of touch over to that very quickly. We've seen a great deal of variability with stock performance. How has current market volatility impacted the development and consolidation of the industry in North America, and what will it look like over the next 5 years?
Yeah, the access to capital has been a major thorn in the side of the development of the cannabis industry in the United States. Not having banking, not having, being heavily taxed via 280E, it's really impacted the growth. But what it's also impacted is the ability to get financing to run your business. And so as a result, there's been, as the market has expanded in the US, in Illinois, Michigan, and elsewhere, there's been more players requiring more money, but there just hasn't been as much money available. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no money out there, but it's just tougher to get. So as growers, as operators, people really need to be cognizant of how competitive the financing market is, and they need to put their best foot forward in terms of making the pitch to acquire that money.
And we, in our phone discussion, we talked a little bit how the stock market can also drive innovation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, as more and more players enter into this space, there's been, and as investors toggle between their risk tolerance, sometimes it's riskier, they'll do more on the plant touching side, and other aspects it's, if there's a change in Attorney General, for example, there may be shifts in the risk tolerance of those investors, and so they may invest in the infrastructure or the picks and shovels. And so that's because there's been that toggling between plant touching and non-plant touching investment, it's driven innovation even in that sense. And then also as the cost is a major factor and profitability comes into play, then that's driving innovation as well. Areas to reduce cost, energy consumption, lighting, air movement, especially on the indoor side. All of this comes into play and is driving that type of innovation. And it's also driving innovation on the propagation side. 4 or 5 years ago, I never even thought about stem cell propagation. Very, very low cost, and that's an innovation that was outside of the industry but has since been brought in.
Let's talk a little bit about biomass production. Biomass production for plant extraction and minor cannabinoid isolates, including CBD, is a rapidly expanding and competitive commodity market. How will supply and demand influence where and how this area of the industry develops over the next 5 years?
Yeah, on the industrial side of things, with the Farm Bill that was passed in 2018, a lot of people jumped into the market. The number of acres licensed, for example, increased over 400%. It went from roughly 100,000 acres licensed to 500,000 acres, right? And so a lot of people got in thinking that they were just going to get rich and everybody was going to be doing CBD and all this stuff. And that wasn't the case because there was a lot of infrastructural and supply chain issues that people didn't anticipate when they jumped in. And so the supply chain has really limited the growth and development of the industrial hemp market. Now that's starting to change, but it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take years and not months, for example. And processing seems to be the biggest bottleneck in the entire supply chain. There's a lot of demand out there, and so there's been talks of oversupply. There's just oversupply relative to the capacity for the processors to process it. It's not necessarily, in my opinion, it's not necessarily oversupply relative to the demand. You've got large cosmetic manufacturers, you've got large beverage providers that are just waiting in the wings doing their product development, but they just don't trust the supply chain yet, and so that's inhibiting the growth. The demand's there, just not enough supply making it into the market. Where will it be in 5 years? I think certainly those supply chain issues in terms of not only processing, but packaging, transportation, storage, drying. All of that on the biomass side, on the industrial side, will have a place in the market. And I think the opportunity for industrial hemp is far larger than the higher THC side of cannabis, because there's more product offerings and product capabilities. The fiber side, everybody talks about CBD because it's sexy, but there's bioplastics, there's food products, there's industrial applications that people really aren't talking about. But I think that is the next wave of the industrial side of cannabis.
Especially how that can kind of, I think, revitalize rural communities too. The idea that where you could have hemp farming and industrial production and manufacturing within the same town and allow those communities to grow again. I'm really excited about that too.
Yeah, that's where that whole co-op concept comes into play, because large consumers of isolate or distillate on the CPG side, they're looking for consistency in their product offerings and their product inputs, the raw material inputs. And so communities have the opportunity to sync up, plant the same strain, harmonize on their production capacity and their capabilities, and then cobble together enough supply to satisfy these large actors in the space.
Let's go back to the sort of global idea. In equatorial regions, we're talking about outside of the U.S. and North America, will outdoor and greenhouse biomass production be a competitive force against indoor giants in cooler climates? And how will discussions, well, let's start there. I'll follow up.
So I think that debate is still going to occur with respect to producing cannabis in tropical areas because of the moisture content and the humidity. And so there's issues associated with mold and other things that need to be addressed. And there's not a whole lot of seeds or genomes, let's say, that thrive in tropical regions. And so there's large opportunities for those that can supply into those areas. However, one thing that was, I mentioned earlier that we were in Zimbabwe and we talked to the government about deploying a hemp program there and kind of outline jobs and economic development and the benefits. And they started a program just recently. What they didn't realize is that because of their proximity relative to the equator, the plants grew faster and they matured quicker and they had a faster time to market. And so there was a competitive advantage that they didn't even realize that they had as a result of that. They had to adjust their propagation strategies and their cultivation operations and the like to adjust for that, but they were pleasantly surprised. And so I think that is one thing that we'll see as more and more global cannabis cultivation occurs. And there are players like in Thailand and Laos that are looking at establishing a foothold to supply into Asia. And they have low inputs from a cost perspective. And so they may be able to take a lot of the market share that the colder climate cultivators currently have.
And once we start to see a global market, expanding global market, the idea that we could actually start to cultivate chemovars in their land race environments and being able to have that specialization is very exciting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, the opportunities are really unlimited. Now, over 80 countries have some form of cannabis legalization, either for CBD, for medical, for industrial hemp.
Yeah, we're
so,
behind.
Yeah, and so the U.S. market, in that sense, is actually behind, and they need to catch up in order to remain competitive in the global marketplace.
How will discussions around climate change and industry sustainability influence sourcing outcomes?
I think on the climate change side of things, what it's driving is the conversation and education, and that's a really good thing to do. The education about how, what the carbon footprint is, what the impact of water consumption, use of pesticides on the environment. I think all of that is good to analyze and study and educate people. What we're also seeing is that it's changing the behavior of investors. And for those that have a brand that highlight their lack of environmental impact, let's say, and their considerations for climate change and the like, those are differentiating factors that are good for a brand that they can promote in the future. We're also seeing on the investment side that, and this is similar for wine growers as well, they're competing for the same land and they're chasing land opportunities north. So for example, some of the Napa Valley growers of grapes are moving into Southern Oregon and competing for Southern Oregon land, and so it's increasing the property valuations as a result. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of influence that that climate change has had on the industry as a whole.
As an industry in its infancy, the cannabis industry has the opportunity to really take hold of sustainability and innovation and present a model, a standard of best practices for other environments. We have people here today, obviously, that aren't just in the cannabis industry. How do you see that playing out over the next 5 years, that sort of interaction between the cannabis industry and other agriculture?
Well, I think that in driving of the innovation, a lot of this has come from within the industry. And so that's been a good thing. And I think that over time this will expand, because for the longest time the community was very secretive, and because of the illicit nature of it. So there wasn't as much mind share that has occurred, that it didn't occur previously, and it's starting to occur now. So now that people are talking, they're sharing best practices and the like, and as a result, there's a greater push towards sustainability just because it's in the conversations. And then I'm not sure if cannabis has gotten the respect that it's due in terms of the maturity of the market, the generations of effort that people have put into it. And so there's not as much of a push from the outside on the sustainability side as there is from the inside pushing out. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. You really take charge if we do it right. What are you seeing now in terms of cannabis and hemp cannabis commodity product price fluctuation?
Yeah, so on the higher THC side, as markets mature and you get more cultivation, then prices just naturally go down. On the industrial side, it was a buyer's market this last harvest, meaning that the processors had the upper hand because there was limited capacity, and as such, they were able to drive the price down. And I didn't necessarily see a bottom. I thought that there might be, but I saw some quotes out there at 40 cents or 60 cents per percent of CBD for hemp biomass, which is just shocking considering just a year ago it was approaching $4. And so one thing to consider, though, is that although it's a highly competitive market in the US, both for industrial and for higher THC cannabis, people need to keep a watchful eye on the international development, because those people that are looking at the Thailand market, they want to drive their production costs down to less than a penny a gram.
Especially if we're talking about competing with, talking about cannabis as medicine, a 10-cent per pill ibuprofen. How do we get to that point? What kind of price point do we need to get to with commodities, with hemp commodities, to be able to actually compete against like pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter drugs?
Yeah, so as the prices go down on a global basis, then that will benefit those folks that need it most, the medicinal patients that don't have the means in which to acquire their medicine. And so I see that as a good thing. It just makes it challenging from a business perspective in that interim period. Oh, and one other thing is that not only is the cannabis cultivation, expanding globally and driving the competitive nature and on the global side, other countries are an existential threat. But keep in mind that the pharmaceutical companies aren't necessarily standing idle, and so they're creating products and doing more research, and so they're just as much as an existential threat than just the global marketplace. And here's an example. So in 2017, the CBD market was roughly a $700-800 million market in the U.S. And half of the CBD was supplied by the marijuana side, half of it was supplied by the hemp. Fast forward just into 2019, now a full third of the market is supplied from GW Pharma. And so, so there's that existential threat that's occurred that people weren't necessarily anticipating even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago.
That being said, I think we've seen a shift away from people's trust in pharmaceuticals, especially after the opioid crisis. How will cultural paradigm shifts, like increased interest in local and organic sourcing and alternative medicine in the wake of the opioid crisis, influence the future of the cannabis and hemp cannabis markets?
So I think that will play a large role because we've done, at New Frontier Data, we've done a lot of surveys, not only in the US, but globally. And we're about to come out with some results on the EU CBD studies and the US CBD surveys. And what we're seeing, not to steal any headlines here, but what we're seeing is that people, while they don't necessarily want pharmaceutical drugs and supply, they trust it from a safety perspective. And so until the point comes where the cannabis market can demonstrate that there's safe, consistent supply, dosage, that's consistent on a delivery mechanism that people trust, then there's always going to be that stigma attached from a safety perspective. But once they can overcome that, then it's very, very viable that they can steal a lot of market share away from the pharmaceutical demand.
Do you think there's any possibility of any sort of policy shift that would allow pharmaceutical research and craft and industry growers to all have a little piece of the pie?
There's a lot of discussion on these very topics, reform for veterans, allowing for research, and in fact, we just helped prep some folks for some congressional testimony for next week in DC, and they're really pushing for the ability to do research, the ability to allow veterans access to, in order to move this along. Just recently, I spoke in Portland, Oregon, at the Oregon Health Sciences University. It was the topic was the benefits of cannabis on the human body. And there's not a whole lot of research out there, except for some good work being done in, say, Israel or Canada and like. But a lot of the doctors there that had done some research showed that there was an impact on the human body, but it just needed more research in order to fully vet it out, to see what's an appropriate dosage, what impact does it have on spasticity, on pain management, and childhood epilepsy and the like. So it's just, there's going to be more research done, and there's a push, a lot of discussions at the federal level. It's unfortunately just taking some time.
Absolutely. In the last few minutes before we move to questions, I know you have an interest in talking about intentionality, and I'd like to give you a little time to kind of go into that.
Yeah, it's a lot of in the research that we've done, there's the concept of intent that's coming up a lot. Farmers in France, for example, growing industrial cannabis with the intention of supplying a specific market. Farmers in the Midwest, for example, that are coming together to grow a specific crop for fiber or for a specific product. That intentionality has been it's been coming up a lot. But in addition, there's been people that have jumped into this market that want to do good things for good people. And so that intention also has been really resonant with me personally, as well as with others, because it just promotes goodness in a world right now where that can be considered a challenge.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered today?
No, I think that just a couple of closing thoughts. There's right now it's roughly a $13 billion legal market, and it's growing for higher THC just alone, and that's just in the United States. But it's really a $70 billion market if you look at the illicit activity and the illicit distribution channels. So there's a tremendous opportunity for those that get in here still. If they have a good value proposition, then they can get some money, right? But there's this tremendous opportunity still. Now, based upon some research that we did last year, the global market's a $350 billion market, and 230 million consumers globally just of higher THC cannabis. So there's a market out there that is relatively untapped, and for those people that have the vision, have the ability, have the mindset, the sky is really the limit. It's very, very exciting. It's still in its nascent stages, and that's what really gets me going in the morning, and I don't want to close my computer down at night as a result.
Well, we'll have to come back in 5 years and see how we did. With that, I will move towards questions.
So the question was the GW Pharma number. We had forecasted that in 2019 they had about a third of the U.S. CBD market share. The other equally distributed between higher THC cannabis and industrial cannabis.
They are the only pharmaceutical CBD.
They are the only CBD pharmaceutical on the market. Everything else is within the industry. So, as far as the ability of doctors to prescribe any sort of cannabis outside of a medical program, that really is the only option beyond, your dronabinols and sesmets and such that were from like the 1980s that were THC-like compounds.
Forgive me if this came up already, but have you spoken about the size of the home grow sector and how that would impact the overall market and the future of home grow in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, so the question is regarding home grow and the percentage of the market. In our analysis, we've only seen maybe 2 or 3% of the total production is based in home grow. So it doesn't really necessarily move the needle as much as large scale commercial operations, outdoor production, and like.
What about going forward?
Going forward, it's really tough to say. In my opinion, though, when you can buy tomatoes at the grocery store versus growing them, that's kind of the analogy I make. And so people want to dabble into the home cultivation side, but I'm not anticipating that everybody will stick to it in the long run.
I think that's an excellent question. I do think it is very important moving forward that as new states come online, they allow people to grow at home. I mean, it is not going to be everybody's cup of tea. Not everybody is going to have a garden full in the backyard. But for the people who need large quantities, who want to make sure they know how it's sourced, who find a chemovar that they really like and want to keep it going, who, you know, want to have control over their own medicine, that has to be a priority. And I don't think it's, you know, just as my own personal opinion, and I'm not an economist, but I don't think it's going to compete with the market as a whole. You know, people still want something, you know, that they can, their grocery stores still exist, even though gardens, you know, people are growing gardens. But I think it's extremely important that that is in place in every single state.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Eric Matos. I'm with the Greenhouse Lighting Consortium. My question is regarding market, where the market's going. We get questions sometimes, people asking with the legalization here in US coming up on the states, eventually getting national legalization, where the cultivation gonna go? We work with lighting, so my question has this, we're trying to see the lighting market. So the final question is, if it gets legalized everywhere, do you think the cultivation gonna go to greenhouses, they're going to go outdoors, and would they move to the southern states where you have a lot of lighting, or are they going to go up north and going with the controlled environmental agriculture setup? So those market trends, is that possible to do any estimative and guesses?
Well, the longevity of the indoor market will be determined by the federal regulators. Because right now each state has to set up their own closed system in order to legalize and cultivate and distribute cannabis. And so that's great for suppliers of the picks and shovels into the market because you have to set up a new market in every state that legalizes. Now there's a push to allow for exports out of states that have a competitive advantage, such as California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado. And so if that push to allow for exports occurs and comes to fruition, then that could be a threat to the size of the opportunity for greenhouse suppliers for indoor lighting and HVAC and the like. So in the short run, over the next few years, definitely a strong opportunity for suppliers that support the indoor and greenhouse grow operations.
Well, we talk to a lot of craft artists and cultivators, whether no matter how they're growing, and in the northern region, they look to the development of appellation as something that will really help them survive. What do you think that role will be, and other things like that that might help support craft growers?
So one of the negatives about large-scale cultivation is that it limits the amount of different varietals in this space. And so that's why I appreciated your answer on home grows, is because you'll have that different varietal that works well with that individual person. Now, as I see it in the future, there'll be AVA or aviary zones where growers will grow in specific regions of the country with specific soil composition and humidity and climate, and they'll be known for those limited productions. And so I think that there's great opportunity for small-scale production of that nature. It's similar to wine, right? You grow a particular varietal of grape, and then it's a limited run because you have limited space in which to grow. I think that is very, very viable in the future. Now, with respect to the Appalachia region, I was recently in Tennessee and Kentucky.
Appellation.
Oh, Appalachian. Oh, right. Sorry. I thought you... And so, no, with... Right. So, no, I think there'll be specific zones that will be known. There'll be destinations. You'll set up canna tourism. You'll come to that vineyard model, and I think that's definitely viable for a lot of the states that can grow.
Appreciate you mentioning cannatourism, and maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that. As a cannabis policy professional, I recognize that we have a huge lack of license types that encourage the tourism side of the business, and it ends up being just yet another piece of the underground market for cannabis. But maybe anything that you've seen or what you might expect to happen around cannabis tourism?
So on the cannatourism side, what we saw in our numbers in the forecast is that there is this cannatourism effect. We saw it heavily in Nevada because people come into Nevada, they go to Las Vegas, they have their fun over a weekend, and we predicted what the surge in demand would be relative to the cannatourism in Nevada, but we underestimated it because what people do is they buy way more than they could possibly consume over that weekend in Las Vegas. But there is an effect of cannatourism from into Oregon, into California, and the like, even in the Northeast with Massachusetts and going up into the New England area, and there's a viable market there. The viability, though, will be determined by the regulators in those states because they can have a major influence on setting up policies that are favorable for cannatourism or not. And then also social consumption is another issue that is on the forefront right now. And so there are these pushes in Colorado and Oregon and elsewhere to allow for social consumption, but it's kind of lower on the priority list than some of the other things like export, like supply and demand and balancing licenses and like. So it hasn't quite percolated up yet to be one of those issues that will coalesce with the policymakers and will succeed through the legislative process. But it's a huge industry. It's just relatively untapped right now.
I think that's it. We did a great job. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.